Guys, did anyone get time to configure their own data guard at home? Maybe like you created a VM or something like that. Did you guys try it? Yes, no, maybe. I think this is the article we were using. So guys, in this article, the one most important parameter that we are going to discuss right now is the redo transport parameter. This parameter log archive dest2, this is the parameter that defines how the log files, whether it is redo log or archive log, how they will be transferred or transported to the standby server. So let me copy this one onto notepad. So this parameter, guys, very important parameters, and this one parameter will define the perfect shipping of redo log files or the archive log files. Now understand this. Let's take, if you are going for such configuration, I'll give you an example. So guys, this is the primary database, and you can have one physical standby, and then you can have one more logical standby, and then you can also have an active data guard, right? I mentioned like in our last session also. And in this kind of situation, if you have a physical standby, in this case you will be using logdest2, right? So generally on primary, what happens is logdest1 will be the local location, because on the same server, the destination one for archive logs will be the same server itself, right? But in a standby configuration over here on the same primary server, the log destination 2, that means where do we want to ship the logs, will be physical standby, right? And log dest 3 will be logical standby, and log dest 4 will be active data guard. So this is how in general things are configured in real time. So if you have one primary and multiple standby databases, then you need to make sure these particular destinations are sending the log files to the correct destinations, right? So as in our case, we have a physical standby setup, so we are using only log archive destination 2. So what happens in this parameter? So this service parameter will define using which network service the connection should or the archive log should be transported. So we have a prod db underscore st, like in our case we definitely have test underscore s, that's the connection name which points to the standby server. Sync and async. Let us first debug this sync and async. So sync parameter and async parameter. If you set it to sync parameter, the thing is like your log writer on primary will wait until the redo entries are accepted by the standby site. So LGWR will wait until RFS gives green signal that the redo entries are received. Alright. Now in this case again there are two more modes, affirm and no affirm. Affirm mode and no affirm. What happens in this, like within sync, if you set it to affirm mode, then the RFS will actually wait until the redo entries are completely returned to the SRLs, standby redo log files. Okay, the default mode is no affirm, and in no affirm the log writer on primary will send the redo entries to the RFS. So once the RFS receives the redo entries, it will give the acknowledgement saying okay, redo entries are received, and it will not wait until the redo entries are returned to the SRL. Alright, and that's the reason the default mode is no affirm, and the affirm mode will always be used with the max protection mode. But as I mentioned, it's a highly impossible, or very rare, once in a blue moon you might see a max protection mode configuration for Oracle database. All right. So in sync, there are two modes, AFFIRM and NOAFFIRM. AFFIRM means the RFS will wait for the redo entries which are coming from the primary to be returned to the standby redo log files, and then only it will give an acknowledgement to the log writer on the primary, right? If the default one is NoAffirm, in NoAffirm, LogWriter will send the redo entries to RFS, and once RFS receives the redo entries, it will immediately give acknowledgement to LogWriter saying like the redo entries are received. In that way, like LogWriter will continue to work. The async mode, which is the default mode, like by default it works in an async mode, right? So even if you specify or don't specify, it will be async mode. In async mode, log writer on the primary will not wait for RFS to give green signal. So the log writer on primary will work independently. RFS, whether it got the redo entry or not, whether the standby is in sync or not, those all things do not matter. And this async mode is more important for max performance, because by default your data guard works in max performance mode and also max availability mode. And guys, the max availability mode is generally the sandwich between these two. Okay, so once we are into mode changing and all, I'll explain more, but for now we are understanding the log archive destination to parameter. So sync parameter, log writer will wait for RFS to give the green signal, and within sync you have affirm and no affirm modes. Affirm means RFS has to write the redo entries first onto the SRLs and then give the green signal, and in no affirm, RFS will not wait for the redo entries to be returned to the SRLs before giving the green signal. Async mode is the one that we are using. That means the RFS and log writer will work independently in async mode. Whether your standby is in sync, the redo entries are received or not, it's not. I mean, log writer is not worried about all those parameters. Now that you know sync and async, the biggest question or the next question is, how do you identify whether it is a archive transport or it is a redo log file transport, or we should write redo log file transport, or it is redo entry transport? This is one of the most important questions which I always ask experienced DBAs, and if you know the answer to this one, that means you are very confident in Oracle Data Guard. See, by looking at this setting for log archive destination 2, how do you say whether your data guard is sending the archive log files on the standby, whether it is reading from the redo log files, or whether it is directly reading from redo log buffer? Can anyone tell me the answer if you want to try this answer? Come on guys, how do you tell what type of transport is being used currently? No idea?
I'm thinking maybe it's this a parameter that is passed inside the online log file.
Okay, I'll explain about valid for parameter in some time, but remember I mentioned like the valid for parameter is for a different use, and I'll talk about it in some time. So guys, by default, if you do not specify, there are two keywords that you need to remember, and if you specify LGWR, okay, LGWR with SYNC with sync parameter, LGWR with async parameter, and I think, see, if you don't specify any parameter, like we did not use any of the LGWR parameter in this log archive destination 2, that means by default from the production the archive logs are being transferred. All right, I will draw the architecture for you and then you will understand what how our current scenario works. All right, so we have the primary database, right? And on primary we have the redo log buffer, right? From there we know that we have log writer. This is the log writer process. Log writer will write it to redo log files, right? The redo log files in the cyclic order, online redo log files. And from there we have an archiver process, right? Arc0. The archiver process will write to archive log files. Now in this configuration what happens is, by default inside the database you have 4 background archiver processes: arc0, arc1, arc2 and arc3. These are the, if you check log archive max process parameter, so in a default configuration you can have 4 archive log background processes. So the archive0 process will be assigned to convert the online redo log files into archive log files. And similarly what happens at this stage, another process arc1 will be started, and this process is responsible to put or copy the entries from the archive log files to the RFS. And on the target side what happens is RFS will write it to the SRLs. We know standby redo log files, right? These are special type of redo log files, and from standby redo log files again the MRP will apply the archive log files to the standby database. This is how our current setup is working. Now the question is, how do you change? There is a problem in this kind of setup, guys. Remember, if on the primary database some transaction is going on, so the transaction will reflect on standby only when there is a log switch, because whenever there is a log switch, a log will be switched on online redo log files, the archiver process will create a new archive log file, and when the new archive log file is created, then only the archive1 process will ship the redo entries to the standby database. That means there is a gap over here, little bit gap in this kind of configuration. So the question is, how do we change this configuration so that you don't have a gap like this? Otherwise the standby will at least wait for a log switch to happen, and then only the contents are applied onto the standby, right? This is our current setup. So that means according to our notepad, if you do not specify any type of service over here, it will be by default archive shipping. So archive logs are being shipped. Now the same, let me copy it. Now if I put it something like this, if I mention LGWR async, and over here I'll mention LGWR sync. So I have changed these parameter a little bit and everything else remains same. Alright, so what happens if you specify LGWR async? Okay, so in LGWR async the architecture will change a little bit, guys. In LGWR async the LNS process will come into picture. Okay, so the LNS process will directly read from online redo log files and it will send to the RFS process. This is how, can you see, we have shifted from archive log files to the LNS, and this is a pretty good configuration, and I guess most of the times this is what is preferred in order, in most of the databases, because if you see in the archive log files, the RFS or the standby needs to wait for the archive logs to be switched. So once the redo log file are switched, then only new archive file will be generated, and once new file is generated then it will be applied. So if you are using this log writer async, then you are moving one level up. So now you are copying the redo entries directly from the online redo log files and pushing onto the standby server. But is there a better way? Like see over here also, until unless log writer writes the entries onto the online redo log files, still the LNS needs to wait until the redo entries are written to these files, right? So if there is huge redo generation, then there will be a difference over here, because log writer will be quickly writing the entries and LNS will be shipping those entries. So LNS is now dependent on log writer. Until unless log writer writes the contents onto the redo log files, LNS will not be able to ship the contents. So is there a better way? So the next level is log writer sync. So if you are using this parameter, what happens is LNS will move one level up, and now it is reading directly from the instance of the primary database. So in the instance of the primary, we have the redo log buffer, right? So from the redo log buffer, both the log writer and LNS will read consistently, like simultaneously. So LNS is no more dependent on log writer. LNS will read the contents from the log buffer, and meanwhile also the log writer will also read from the redo log buffer, and LNS will continue to ship these entries to the RFS. Now guys, if you want LNS to work directly with redo log buffer, then you have to use the sync parameter. So whenever you are using sync parameter, that means the LNS will wait for RFS to give the acknowledgement, right? So ultimately the log writer sync is used. You have to change this log archive destination to log writer sync only when you're going for max protection mode, right? Otherwise, if you are using the max availability mode or performance, if you're using max availability or max performance mode, then log writer async mode is more than enough, and 99.9% of the time this is what you should use. But otherwise, in most cases, if you are just not going for a true switchover failover kind of condition, then most of the times this is more than enough. In this case, what happens is once the archive is generated, archive will be applied onto the standby. It's up to you. If you just change this parameter to log writer async, then rather than archive log files, directly the LNS will be sending the entries by reading from the online redo log files. So guys, any doubts in this one before I start explaining you about the valid for parameter?
Arun, can you go through that what you have drawn just once again?
This one?
Yes, yes.
Okay. I think I would suggest Satish you can once again watch the recorded session, right? Any specific doubt?
Okay, okay. No problem. I'll watch it, and if I any doubt, I'll come back to you.
Right. So guys, this is on the primary side. Like primary side, you have 3 tiers, or you can say level 1 where archives will be sent to the standby. You have level 2 option where LNS will read from the online redo log files and send to the standby, or you have level 3 where LNS will directly read from the redo log buffer and send the entries to the standby. This is primary side modes. But on the standby, are there any other different types of modes like standby redo log files? And see, as I mentioned, it is up to you. If you want, you can also set up the archive logging of the SRLs on the standby, right? So let us assume we have standby log files, and these are the archive log files, standby archive log files, right? So the MRP process is capable of applying from both the standby redo log files or the archived standby redo log files. But in earlier versions like 11J and all, definitely you had an option to choose between applying from the archives or applying from the SRL. So if you apply from the SRL, it is known as real-time apply. Okay, but like from 12C onwards, you only have real-time apply. Okay, so the issue was earlier the RFS used to write the contents in the standby redo log files like a normal redo log file, and once the standby redo log file is full, once the log switch happens, the archive file will be generated, and once the archive file is generated, then only the MRP will apply the archive log to the standby. This was earlier process. But in this case, what happens is MRP needs to wait for the archive file to be generated. The archiver process on standby needs to wait for the SRL to get full, and there should be a log switch. So in that case, what used to happen is you can even run MRP in real-time mode, where as RFS is writing into the SRL file, the same redo entries are being applied to the standby database. This is something we can configure, but that option was available in 11G and other versions, but from 12C R2 it's only real time, because there is no point in waiting for the standby archive log files to be generated. But in the background, what happens is MRP is smart. Okay, MRP knows, let's take, if RFS is writing very fast and there are frequent log switches, MRP can go to the standby archive log files, pick it up and apply to the standby database. So with these kind of information, guys, this is very important. As I always say, concepts are more important than the commands. You can always get the commands anywhere online. Now this valid for parameter is also important. This parameter will define this log archive destination to when it should be valid. Alright, so first of all, this first part will define what is the current mode it is running. Like the primary database, definitely it will be running in primary mode, right? So if you see this, sorry, the second part is primary role. Okay, so the current database, if it is in primary role where online log files are being archived, because we know that archiver process 0, right? This will be archiving the online log files, correct? So when the current server acts or works in a primary role, then only the log archive destination 2 should be valid. Now why it is there, let me show you something. Assume that, guys, if in that parameter we do not have valid for parameter, okay, there is no valid for parameter. So what will happen is on primary, whenever you have log files, this is online redo log files, and from there this is archiver process, and from archiver process you have archive files, right? So log des2 is pointing to the standby server, right? On standby also we have this parameter, correct? Log dest2, and we know that it is pointing onto the primary side. So if you do not specify the valid for parameter, then what happens is primary will continue to send the log files on standby, and on standby the SRLs that are being generated, they will be sent reverse back onto the primary server. So this is like wastage of space, and you will get into a round robin circulation of sending redo log files from one server to the another. So to avoid that, we are saying that whenever the current server is in primary role and when the current log files on the server are being archived, only then you enable the log destination 1. So on the standby server, the log destination 2, if you check the parameter, it is not in primary role. So that means if it is not in primary role, it cannot send the logs in this direction. When standby will convert into primary, and when primary will convert into standby, this destination will become valid because the role is now changed to primary, and it will start sending in this direction. But the same, because this server has been converted into standby, I mean it will become invalid. because it is in standby role, and that's why this server will not be flowing the logs in this direction. So there is a reason why this parameter is important, otherwise both the servers will be sending the log files from one side to the another. And DB unique name parameter is again important for this destination. So this destination, whatever the DB unique name you give over here, it should match the DB unique name on the standby server. Otherwise, again, it will be a problem. So guys, I want you to watch this video only for this parameter as at least 2-3 times to understand how this parameter works.